Marty Baron was in Vienna. Not Vienna, Virginia, not Vienna, Illinois, but the Vienna, Austria, to accept an international award as the best journalist in the U.S. What an honor it is to have you here today. At one of his last, he was telling us last night, at one of his last award ceremonies, the director was of the award presentation was George Clooney. Touching elbows here with some pretty important people. Most of us have probably saw Baron depicted as in the film Spotlight, where he was the Boston Globe editor who propelled the Spotlight investigative team to disclose the previously hidden story about Catholic priests assaulting children. Later, as editor of the Washington Post, he won multiple Pulitzer Prizes during the lead up to and the first Trump administration. More recently, Baron has differed with publisher Jeff Bezos for cozying up, those are my words, cozying up to President Trump. In an acceptance speech earlier this year, Baron spoke about his single-minded focus on the core values of journalism, and he said it so beautifully: to be honest, honorable, fair, ambitious, unflinching, and independent. We are honored to have you here today, Marty.
Thank you, Bill, for those wonderful introductory remarks. It's a real pleasure to be here in St. Louis. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's wonderful to meet you, Charles, after all these years. And congratulations on your 100th birthday. It's a real honor to be here and to be here for the Gateway Journalism Review celebration of the First Amendment. In arguing for that amendment, James Madison, who was its principal author, he expressed the need for freely examining public characters and measures. I always fixate on the word examining and recommend reading its dictionary definition, which is to inspect closely, to inquire into carefully, to investigate, to test by questioning in order to determine progress, fitness, or knowledge. I am proud that the newsrooms I have led have lived up to the meaning of that word and have met Madison's expectation for how the press, in service of a strong republic, should make use of the freedom it was given. I've been a journalist for nearly half a century, and for every one of those years, I have known only a free and independent press in this country. When I began my career in the 1970s, Americans could see clearly how the press served democracy. With the publication of the Pentagon Papers, first by the New York Times, the public learned of the failures its government had covered up during a long war in Vietnam that cost so many lives. And then there was Watergate, an investigation spearheaded by the Washington Post. The public learned how its president had weaponized the government against his political adversaries, how he had abused his powers, sabotaged the Constitution, and committed crimes. The press not only served democracy, the broader public interest was a beneficiary too. When there was grave wrongdoing, often no one but journalists explored the facts. That was true when we at the Boston Globe investigated a decades-long cover-up of sexual abuse within the Archdiocese of Boston, and as it turned out, in the Catholic Church worldwide. Priests, bishops, and cardinals had betrayed their parishioners. The church had betrayed its principles. A religious hierarchy had exploited its political and legal power and a claim to spiritual authority to shield its own reputation at the expense of children in its care. Denial and deceit were both practice and policy. Over the years since, as that investigation's impact has unfolded from one country to the next, Nothing in my career has meant more to me than conversations with survivors. To this day, they have shared their appreciation for the journalists who listened to their stories and delivered overdue justice. And I should mention that one of the great advocates for survivors of that abuse is here today. I was happy to run into him, David Klotzer, who is somewhere out there. He's been a brave advocate for survivors long before we at the Boston Globe got around to doing that story. Now, over the decades, I took for granted that we would always have a free press in this country, that the First Amendment would guarantee it, and that the media would and could fulfill its mission of holding our government to account. I no longer take any of that for granted. I can't be certain the rule of law will prevail, can't be confident that a free press will endure, or that free expression for all Americans will either. I see a president behaving as if he were granted the kingly authority that Americans rebelled against 250 years ago. A president who cynically invokes First Amendment rights for himself and his allies while scheming to withhold them from others through baseless lawsuits, regulatory retribution, malicious investigations, sadistic vilification, and unjust deportations. I watch as a servile majority in Congress and a deferential majority on the Supreme Court blithely give him permission and encouragement. Every day, I witness him hammering away at the institutional pillars of democracy, leaving them at risk of buckling under the assault. And seemingly every day, I learn that those institutions, including the press, are more fragile than seemed possible only a year ago. And then there's this. We now live in a time when people are unable or unwilling to distinguish between what is true and what is false. Today, we cannot even agree on how to determine a fact. You know, ever since the Age of Enlightenment, we have relied upon certain factors to establish facts: education, expertise, experience, and above all, evidence. Now, centuries later, every one of those elements is being devalued, if not outright denied. All of this puts democracy in peril. And if democracy is in danger, so is a free press. And if a free press is at risk, so is democracy. They are inextricably linked. Never has there been a democracy without a media that is free and independent. The stakes, by the way, go beyond safeguarding a free press. The freedom to do our work falls under a bigger umbrella: the right of free expression. The anti-democratic storm that is now bearing down upon us threatens to shred that umbrella and all that it protects. The right of musicians, authors, artists, playwrights, screenwriters, comedians, and late-night entertainers to express themselves as they wish. The right of the public to listen to, watch, and read what they feel they should. The right of academics, activists, political leaders, and even business executives to advocate for the policies they believe in. The right of every one of us to speak freely with family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues without fear of surveillance and reprisal. We should worry about the freedom to express opinions and feelings, but we should not lose sight of what aspiring authoritarians ultimately hope to achieve. They aim to extinguish all independent arbiters of fact. The press is among them, but so are judges, scientists, scholars, government statisticians, and many more. None of them is perfect. All are fallible, because all are human. But all are also necessary to navigate the winding, pothole-filled path toward knowledge. The methods of authoritarians go beyond intimidation and retribution against independent arbiters of fact. They also interfere in the impartial collection of information. Data is manipulated, suppressed, and even erased. And in that way, the public is denied access to the indispensable building blocks of truth. Authoritarians assert sole ownership of the truth, but those who arrogantly claim a monopoly on truth and an immunity to error forfeit any claim to credibility. And that applies to anyone, but politicians of that sort rank as the greatest public menace. A feeling of infallibility signals a detachment from reality. It is accompanied by an extreme allergy to criticism. Political leaders with these delusions conceive of every reason to grant themselves more authority while plotting to limit the freedoms of others. Challenging questions are seen as undeserving of response or even respect. Dissenters are treated as heretics and subversives, enemies of the people or the enemy within, even worse than foreign enemies in their way of thinking. In short order, critics are seen as appropriate targets of military force. When leaders with that mentality destroy any meaningful check on the power they have usurped, history offers a lesson on the liberties lost by the rest of us. They are not easily recovered, and they may never be. I've seen what the loss of liberties looks like. Every year, I spend 10 days in Bogota, Colombia, as an instructor in a training program for Latin American editors. 20% or more of the attendees typically have been forced to work in exile. They are among the more than 900 journalists who have fled Latin American countries since 2018. Every year, the participants in that program have made presentations on the conditions in their countries, outlining how, step by step, a war on the press was waged in a grab by leaders for more power. One attendee in January 2023 was Lucia Pineda Ubao, a prominent television news director in Nicaragua, who was arrested in 2018 after her station reported on the massacre of 355 citizens protesting the country's ruler, Daniel Ortega. Police raided the station while she was on air, taking her and a fellow top executive into custody on charges of inciting terrorism and violence. Lucia was imprisoned for 6 months, most of the time in solitary confinement. When finally released under international pressure, she was forced into exile in Costa Rica. A couple of weeks after I saw her in Bogota in 2023, Ortega's government stripped her and 93 fellow Nicaraguans of their citizenship, also confiscating all of their property. Today, she and all genuinely independent Nicaraguan journalists, numbering more than 270, report on their country while compelled to live elsewhere. This past May, I had the opportunity to join Latin American and Spanish media leaders in visiting José Rubén Zamora, one of Guatemala's most respected journalists. His newspaper reported aggressively over decades on what he calls the narco-klepto dictatorship that governed his country. He exposed corruption at the highest levels. For that, he was targeted with bogus charges of money laundering, blackmail, and influence peddling. Zamora spent 812 days in prison before being released to home detention. And after only 4 months there, his prosecutor exploited a technicality to get him thrown in jail again. He has been in prison since March 10. 5 years ago, Zamora's publication shut down, unable to survive as he and 9 colleagues were prosecuted, some merely for writing about Zamora's case, an activity the government defined as obstruction of justice. I am friendly with another courageous journalist, Andras Petho. Andras does his work in Hungary, where for many happy years he was employed by a popular news website. He only left when his work suddenly met with disapproval of the corporate owner, a telecommunications company. Until then, the owner had supported the outlet's investigative reporting. But Viktor Orban's return as prime minister after 8 years out of power brought drastic change. Orban put pressure on the telecommunications company, and it capitulated, calling on its journalists to avoid stories that would anger Orban or his allies. Today, as Andres recounted recently in the Atlantic magazine, his previous employer is unrecognizable as the flagship news site of the pro-government propaganda machine, publishing articles praising Orban and viciously attacking his critics. From all that I can tell, Orban serves as our president's model for how to marginalize, delegitimize, demonize, and economically debilitate an independent press. Orban set up a new media oversight agency, appointing loyalists to run it. The agency blocked mergers by independent media companies and favored those that were pro-government. Although Trump didn't set up a new agency, he named a diehard loyalist to lead the Federal Communications Commission, which previously operated with independents. Almost immediately after becoming FCC chairman, Brendan Carr launched investigations of CBS, NBC, ABC, NPR, and PBS over matters like supposed news distortion. Separately, Carr held up the proposed merger of CBS owner Paramount with Skydance, a deal financed by Larry Ellison, a mega donor to the Republican Party, who has been a strong supporter of Trump's. Trump had sued CBS under a Texas law normally applied to false advertising, seeking an absurd $20 billion over how 60 Minutes edited a campaign interview with Kamala Harris. At about the same time, a conservative group filed a complaint with the FCC alleging news distortion along the same lines as Trump. And Carr said he'd take that complaint into account in deciding whether to approve the Paramount-Skydance merger. Fearful Paramount directors this summer, as you know, decided to settle, agreeing to pay Trump $16 million that would be earmarked for his presidential library. And there was a side deal between Trump and Skydance, the president himself confirmed. Skydance, led by Ellison's son, David, promised that once the merger was completed, it would provide $15 to $20 million in so-called public service advertising on CBS for causes that's supported by the president. Now, within mere weeks of those concessions, the merger was approved. Obviously, not a coincidence. The horror show has continued nonstop. Disney-owned ABC in September canceled Jimmy Kimmel only hours after the FCC chairman, reacting to a remark by the late-night host related to Charlie Kirk's assassination, threatened the licenses of affiliate stations for carrying his show. Two big owners of affiliates, Nexstar and Sinclair, both under FCC jurisdiction, moved even faster than Disney in yanking his show off their stations. The government-orchestrated silencing of Kimmel thankfully ended up being brief, but it fit into a pattern of brutish administration harassment. Only days before, Trump had filed a libel suit against the New York Times and its reporters for $15 billion. Litigation as silly as it was reprehensible. On page 10, Trump's lawyers asserted his, quote, sui generis charisma, his singular brilliance, and his unique business acumen. Now, anyone who marvels at himself that way would naturally view anything less flattering as defamation. Appropriately, a federal judge dismissed the suit as mostly vituperation and an invective, and Trump's lawyers refiled a couple of weeks ago after being scolded by the judge to comply with professional standards. Now to public media and back to Hungary's Orban. As my friend Andres noted, the Prime Minister also transformed public broadcasting, which had previously carried news programs challenging politicians from all parties, into a mouthpiece of the state. And so what has our president done? He cut public media off at the knees, ending all its federal funding. You can expect public radio and TV stations to collapse, perhaps as many as 100. Trump has dismantled the historically independent Voice of America, even as he set up a propaganda site called White House Wire. Hungary's Orban has given a boost to pro-government influencers with a large-scale social media following. Trump has done the same here. MAGA influencers are now welcome to White House press conferences and even get private briefings. The questions, or statements, many of these folks pose are eye-rolling in their sycophancy. Just as Orban barred legitimate news outlets from briefings, Trump banned the Associated Press from the pool of journalists admitted to events in the Oval Office and that accompany him on Air Force One. He did this because the Associated Press would not yield to Trump's insistence that the Gulf of Mexico be called only the Gulf of America. In July, the White House meted out the same punishment to the Wall Street Journal as a reprisal for what it reported about Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. And then he sued the Journal, including its most senior executives, for $10 billion. The Department of Defense in September required press working from the Pentagon to sign a pledge not to disseminate any information, including unclassified information, that has not been officially released. The rules prohibited even asking questions about unauthorized subjects at risk of being identified as a national security risk. Now, all but small, marginal, or conspiracy-minded US media outlets refused to sign, which is good, because any journalist who signs a pledge like that falls more neatly into the categories of stenographer or propagandist. Orban had a telling piece of advice for a conservative American political organization several years ago. Have your own media, he said. That's exactly what Trump wants. And in large part, that is what he is trying to build piece by piece. Now, here's something else. I'm going to get to the optimistic part soon, I promise you. Even I'm getting depressed just sitting here. Here's something else you can anticipate. Trump will almost certainly try to incarcerate journalists. He has been salivating to do so for some time. During rallies a few years ago, Trump promised to send journalists to prison so that he could ascertain their sources. As he put it, quote, "When this person realizes that he is going to be the bride of another prisoner shortly, he will say, 'I'd very much like to tell you exactly who that was.'" Reaction from the crowd to his loathsome vision of prison rape was laughter, applause, and cheers. Trump administration has been laying the groundwork for prosecutions. In April, Attorney General Pam Bondi tossed out many of her department's previous constraints on the government's use of subpoenas and search warrants to obtain testimony and records of journalists relying on anonymous sources. You can now expect the Justice Department to regularly pursue reporters' phone records and emails, and to petition courts to order reporters to divulge their sources. Since journalists are unlikely to do that, you can expect the DOJ to request that they be locked up. The purpose of journalism in a democracy, in my estimation, is to provide the public with the information it needs and deserves to know so that people might govern themselves. Within that mission is what I consider our profession's highest calling: holding powerful individuals and institutions to account. Those with power have the capacity to do enormous good. When they do, and when ordinary individuals do, we in the press should make that known. Praiseworthy efforts to improve our towns, our cities, and our country deserve to be shared with others. Strengthening the ties that bind us is a noble task. At the same time, we know that some wrongs can be committed at extraordinary scale. Often the fault lies with those who possess disproportionate power, including the power to cover up their misdeeds. Immoral or unlawful conduct can go undetected for years or decades. Ordinary people can suffer severe harm. The voices of victims are often ignored or muzzled. If we as journalists do not hold the powerful to account, regardless of their political, ideological, theological, or any other affiliation, often no one will. If we do not investigate when evidence demonstrates grave wrongdoing, we fail in our responsibilities to the public. Our ability to pursue that mission today faces immense, even existential challenges. Our vulnerabilities are many. Those who wish to harm our profession know that now is a perfect time to try. One vulnerability that has stood out recently is ownership. Many of the biggest media outlets have corporate or individual owners who are ripe targets for intimidation. They may be subject to regulatory oversight, or they may be heavily reliant on government contracts, or they may hope for favors for their companies or themselves. One by one, they have cowered before Trump, capitulated to him, or cozied up, neglecting to defend the rights that gave rise to their businesses and sustained our democracy. Another huge vulnerability for an independent press is familiar to all of you: economic insecurity. The truth is that business strategies and tactics will have to be reassessed every few years amid sudden seismic shifts in technology, advertising, and news consumption habits. Inertia is a decision, and a fatal one at that. Experimentation is imperative, with a clear-eyed focus on information the public values most. News outlets must navigate away from a dependence on traffic from search engines and social media. And that means cultivating a genuinely loyal, trusting base of readers, listeners, and viewers who show support with subscriptions or memberships. All who work in our business will have to get comfortable with discomfort. Instability will be with us forever. This will require everyone, from chief executives to union chiefs, to work collaboratively for long-term financial success. On that front, we have a very long way to go. Compounding our problems is declining trust in mainstream media. Trust is at its lowest point in 5 decades. 70% of American adults say they have little confidence in the media or none at all. The inverse of the 1970s, when 70% expressed trust. The press, by the way, is not alone in scoring poorly. Trust in institutions overall has tumbled, but the decline in the press has been the fastest. Now, the issue of trust is complex. You often hear the crisis of trust in media attributed to bias among journalists, and there may well be bias, but it's worth acknowledging that often one person sees bias where another sees truth. We are navigating a highly polarized political landscape. That people can easily find a site that tells them exactly what they want to hear undermines trust too. And of course, a president who day in and day out attacks the press has an impact. In the 10 years since he became a presidential candidate, Trump has assailed the press more than 3,500 times. Yet we in the press cannot just shift blame to others. Low levels of trust in traditional media call for journalists to look inward, to reflect on whether we are going about our work as we should. I believe journalists can best achieve our goals by adhering to traditional journalistic principles. We do ourselves and our democracy no favors if we abandon what have long been our profession's bedrock standards. Too many journalists, largely in response to Trump, have repudiated the old standards. He has declared war on us, the thinking goes, so we must engage in war on him. Their stories and their performative behavior on social media reflect a warrior ethos. That is neither a good look nor good practice for any journalist who hopes to be or expects to be considered an honest broker of fact. I am known for saying, we are not at war, we are at work. It'll probably be on my tombstone. So what do I mean by that? Early in my remarks, I mentioned James Madison's expectation that we in the press, and all citizens for that matter, would examine public characters and measures. That is our work. And when we're at work, our behavior should be that of a professional, not a combatant. At all times, we must practice our craft with true independence and a reverence for evidence over our preconceptions. Getting at the truth requires an open mind, a rigorous method, and a heavy dose of humility. We must be more impressed with what we don't know than with what we know or think we know. We should not start our work by imagining we have the answers. We will better serve the public, and our professional reputations for that matter, by making sure we ask the right questions. Honorable journalism calls for us to listen generously, with empathy and respect to those we cover. There is no place for condescension, contempt, or incivility. People throughout our communities and throughout our country should see their struggles and aspirations reflected fully and fairly. We should assess what information they most need and do our best to provide it. And when we commit errors of fact or judgment, we should acknowledge and correct them. But honorable journalism also requires being fair to the public, and that means being straight with them. We have a duty to tell readers, viewers, and listeners directly, fearlessly, and often courageously what we, through honest and conscientious reporting, find to be fact. I'll mention a few other steps that might help earn the public's confidence. We need to be fully transparent about how we go about our reporting. If we refer to court documents, we should publish them in full. Same with a video or audio recording. Publish it in full. The message to the public should be, you have the right to check our work, and we are giving you the opportunity. Established communications companies also need to face up to this nasty fact. We are largely failing as communicators. We will have to learn from influencers and podcasters about how to convey authenticity. The authority of our reporting matters most. Verification is our first priority, but how we communicate with the public matters a lot as well. And hovering over all of this is the threat of disinformation, which will accelerate with generative artificial intelligence. Fabricated images and audio will be disseminated everywhere instantaneously. They will become harder to detect and refute. The public may be unable to distinguish between what is true and what is false, and they may give up trying, concluding that it is impossible to ever really know. Established media working with experts in AI must develop an infrastructure to counteract this threat, not just because of what it portends for the press, but rather because it imperils democracy and human progress. So the hazards can seem overwhelming, but in fact, I am no defeatist. I was reminded recently of what former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright once said of herself. I am often asked whether I am an optimist or a pessimist, she wrote. My reply is, I am an optimist who worries a lot. You can put me in the same category. So you heard plenty about my worries, and I'm finally getting around to why I remain an optimist. So first, there is still an abundance of strong news coverage, revealing what Americans are entitled to know about their government. Each of these stories is a victory for the press, but more importantly, a victory for the public, a victory for anyone who believes in government of, by, and for the people. Second, I believe we as individuals and as a society are capable of more than we tend to imagine. A favorite quote of mine is from Bernard Lown. He was a cardiologist who, along with his colleagues, won the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize for efforts to prevent nuclear war. And upon accepting that award, he said, "Only those who see the invisible can do the impossible." In other words, what we can't see can be envisioned. What seems impossible can, in fact, be achieved. And I should add that I have never seen anyone succeed by expecting to fail. Optimism is a necessary ingredient for success, and we must succeed. Third, the real world has a habit of wreaking havoc with lies and delusions. You can deny facts for a long while, too long, tragically, but not forever. As Jonathan Rauch, the author of an excellent book, The Constitution of Knowledge, recently said, if you stop vaccinating people for measles, guess what happens? You get measles. Then kids start to die. Then people look around and say, WTF. You can only suspend reality for so long before it hits you in the face. Fourth reason I remain an optimist. As an industry, we have already survived a lot, overcoming travails that might have felled other industries. Some traditional news organizations have made dramatic turnarounds. New, innovative media outlets have emerged and succeeded. Many newsrooms now can boast of talented technologists on staff, and we, as a profession, are far more likely to accept changes in our work that disruptive new technologies demand. Fifth reason. Today, there are promising signs of some rebellion against encroachments on free expression. Jimmy Kimmel's program was reinstated by Disney and ABC as millions of Americans made clear their fury, many canceling subscriptions to Disney streaming services. Then Nexstar and Sinclair restored Kimmel to their stations. The whole episode propelled him to sky-high views on TV and YouTube. Also, a recent New York Times poll showed that more than 60% of Americans felt Trump had gone too far in bringing pressure on the press, with the number rising to 70% among independents and voters under 45. 70% of voters and even 57% of Republicans opposed revoking licenses for television stations that criticized Trump. Of course, it's concerning that tens of millions of Americans either don't understand the First Amendment or would just as soon do without it. But it's heartening that a solid majority appreciates that free expression is an essential right that belongs not to any one party or group, but to every one of us. And ideally, over time, more Americans will recognize that the rights the press seeks to safeguard are no different from the simple, basic rights most people want and deserve for themselves. The freedom to inquire into facts, the freedom to share what they have learned, the freedom to communicate what they believe. The final reason I am optimistic is history. Efforts to silence the press date to the earliest days of American journalism. The inaugural edition of the first American newspaper was published in Boston on September 25th, 1690. The very next day, it was shut down by the Governor and Council of Massachusetts. In 1798, President John Adams signed the Sedition Act. Prosecutions ensued, newspapers were shuttered, editors were jailed. The American people themselves rose up in protest. As the law expired at the end of John Adams' term, journalists were freed, and upon assuming the presidency, Thomas Jefferson declared that the essential principles of government include the diffusion of information and freedom of the press. Now, those freedoms would be challenged again and again, and then, of course, in 1917, under President Woodrow Wilson, as we entered World War I. The Espionage Act, amended the next year with the Sedition Act, brought extraordinary repression. The public and the press were subjected to vast prohibitions on criticism of government. Wilson's predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt, was aghast. Though no stranger to executive power, he understood the boundaries. He condemned those who would, quote, make it a crime to tell the truth. And he reminded President Wilson that the people of this country were his, quote, fellow citizens, not his subjects. The Sedition Act was repealed within a couple of years. The Espionage Act, imprudently expansive and loosely written, remains on the shelf for our current government to weaponize, as it probably will. Not until the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and war with Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany did this country begin to fully embrace the rights of free expression and an independent press. The horror of the Third Reich drove home what the alternative might look like. FDR declared that, quote, representative democracy will never tolerate suppression of true news at the behest of government. Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson wrote this in 1945 on behalf of the First Amendment. Every person must be his own watchman for truth, because the forefathers did not trust any government to separate the true from the false for us. That admonition has been repeatedly tested. Scrutinizing the lies emanating from the Nixon White House landed 50 journalists and 3 newspapers on an actual enemies list. The purpose, as the memo of Nixon counsel John Dean put it, was to use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. As disturbingly familiar as such malevolence may be, the words of the Senate Select Committee that investigated Nixon should echo today as well. The American people, the committee's report declared in 1974, have been reawakened to the task democracy imposes upon them: steadfast vigilance of the conduct of the public officials they choose to lead them. Vigilance of public officials is, above all, the task democracy imposes on every journalist. However severe the pressures we face, holding our public officials to account is a mission we can never forsake. That is the mission envisioned for us by the nation's founders when they signed off on the First Amendment. That was the original assignment for the press in this country. We have no greater responsibility than to accept that assignment and execute it with the full measure of our energy, our strength, and our courage. Thank you for the honor of joining you here today.
Questions? Yes, sir. Michael Sorkin.
So those of us who are working for news outlets that don't stand up when they're pushed or oppressed.
So the question is, what can we do when the news organization essentially doesn't support us, doesn't stand behind our work? Look, it's a tough question to answer. My answer is you do what you can, okay? So you do your stories with honesty, integrity. You know, make sure that they're rigorous, they're accurate, they're fair, all of that. But then you tell people what the facts are. And you have to stand behind those stories. And the day that newsrooms aren't willing to stand behind those stories and they won't publish those stories is the day that you have to think about what the alternative is and whether you have alternatives, but you continue to try to do it. I would wait and see if there's a pattern of that rather than just reacting to one particular story. And I would, you know, and then of course I would confront editors, publishers, owners, what have you, say, well, what are we about if we're not willing to publish that? And I think the staff needs to stand behind that, and ideally you would have an editor, a top editor, who stands behind that and speaks for you. That, I think, is the responsibility of the top editor of the news organization, is to do that on your behalf. And so that's the best you can do. You can't force a change in ownership, you can't force a change in the publisher probably. You may not even be able to force a change in the editor, but you can do your work and do it as well as you can. Put the onus on them to say, no, we're not going to publish it. Don't censor yourself.
More questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Baron, what is your advice for the next generation of journalists who are trying to find their footing at a time where it feels like, as you mentioned, kind of feels the whole industry is under attack?
Yeah, I always get that question. Normally I get that from parents of kids who are trying, and they'll always say, well, what if you were, somebody wanted to get in the, I say, well, do you happen to have a child who's interested? And they go, yeah, I have to confess that I do. And so I always say, ignore your parents. And because, your parents of just a few years ago would have been telling you to go into become a software engineer, and now AI is taking your job away. So anything can happen to anybody. You can't predict the jobs of the future. I mean, I think as long as we have a democracy, we will have a need for for journalism. The public will need information. It will be delivered in a lot of different ways. We will end up communicating, and we should end up communicating in a lot of different ways. So the field of journalism is not just the traditional news organizations. There are a lot of other new ones, as I mentioned, that have emerged, that have succeeded. There are a lot of people experimenting, including at the local level. There's some nonprofits that have had some success. Some will wait and see whether they succeed. So there's a lot of, there's just a lot of experimentation. And so I would seize on that, I would use that, and not just look at the traditional news organizations. And I would also learn new ways of communicating, because people of your generation, as you well know, better than I do, they absorb and consume information in a very different way. And we have to figure out how to get in their, in their heads, in their hands, serious information, and do it in a way that they are willing to absorb. So even if we're on TikTok, I don't want to, it's hard to explain the history of the Middle East in 15 seconds on TikTok, I have to admit, but, you can, in 15 seconds, you can give people like a tasting menu of like, here's what's in your report, and if you want to know more, you can go here. And so we ought to be offering people, for example, tasting menus. And we do need to work on this issue of authenticity, because, here's the thing, is that we have always focused on the authority, and we should focus on our authority, the reporting, the verification, all of that is the first priority. On the other hand, we don't get credit for that authority because somehow we're not communicating authenticity. And then you have influencers who are communicating a lot of authenticity, and they get credit for a lot of authority that sometimes they deserve, but a lot of times they don't. And so we need to say, okay, well, there's something that we need to work on, and we shouldn't just look at that with disdain and dismissal and all of that. We did that at the beginning of the internet age, just dismiss things. We were slow, we were stubborn, and we were stupid. And we shouldn't do that again. So we need to learn from people who are succeeding and say, how do we do that ourselves? And so I would suggest that anybody who's getting in the field is sort of study the field, study how people are getting information, and how can we communicate serious work in different ways.
More questions? Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts on the tipping points that we might look for and help move forward to make a change here?
Tipping point for what exactly?
The tipping points for our president.
That's what I thought you meant.
I was afraid you were going to ask that. I was afraid. I was going to talk about the newspaper industry or the media industry generally or something like that. But honestly, I don't know. I'm not a political pundit, and I work really hard not to be a political pundit. I get called all the time to show up on this show or that show, and let's talk about all of these range of things. And I say, no, I'm not going to. I don't want to be a political pundit. I'm no more insightful than anybody else, and I think we've seen that a lot of political punditry turns out to be terribly wrong. So I don't want to include myself in that sad group of people who makes wrong predictions. I mean, I've made wrong predictions about the newspaper industry. Jack Schaefer, who was, had been a media critic at various places, recently Politico, and he's now moved on. He contacted me a few months ago, and he said, "Hey, so I was just looking through my files, and I see that you said that there would be no more print in 10 years, and it's been 10 years since we spoke. What do you have to say now?" I said, "Jack, there won't be any more print in 10 years." So, yeah.
You went through that change with the Catholic Church. Very effectively, you were a tipping point in that effort. And so maybe can you frame it in that way?
Sure.
What were your experiences there that really made a difference?
Facts.
A tipping point.
Yeah, facts. Well-documented facts, and that you've laid it out. One of the great advantages for us in the instance of the Catholic Church is that we went to court and we obtained all of the internal church documents. Their communication with parishioners, their communication with single moms, telling them that the priests would be taken out of ministry, and then it turned out those priests were just reassigned to another parish. So the public could see for itself from the documents that the church was lying. Not once, but over and over and over again, and that was its policy and its practice. And I think that this administration, what it's most concerned about is not opinions. The real battle is not over opinions. The real battle is over facts. We're continuing to debate, or they're continuing to debate, the 2020 election, or what happened on January 6th. Were those insurrectionists, or were they, patriots on, a normal tour of the White House? I've never received a brochure for a tour like that, but but this is what, or that it's normal civic discourse. It doesn't seem that way to me. But in any event, I think it's facts that they're concerned about, and facts have had an impact. And people think that the journalism doesn't have an impact, but it does have an impact. It may not have the impact that it had before, but it clearly has an impact. The reality is that Trump was thrown out of office. Okay, I mean, because people saw his policies and they saw his personality, and they said we didn't want any more of him. But in the intervening 4 years, they came to develop a different view of him, and then they came up with an assessment of Joe Biden as well, and ultimately Kamala Harris. So, and they put him back into office, not by, in the popular vote, not by a huge margin, but, significant enough, and certainly in the electoral vote, a very significant margin. But, he, in his first term, he was never above 50% approval rating from the public. He's below 50% now. The problem for those who oppose the president is that the Democratic Party's approval rating is lower than Trump's low approval rating. So what's necessary is not just for the press to do its work, which I think it is doing its work, and people are not happy with his policy on the economy, his policy on immigration, even his policy on a whole range of things. He's below water, but they look at what's the alternative, and they're not happy with the alternative. And so it's not all within our control. People think somehow the press controls this. The press doesn't control it, clearly. So ultimately, there needs to be a solid opposition, and the opposition hasn't solidified. Back there.
Yeah, John. And then Brian.
Sober.
Talk louder, John.
Wrestling.
Right, okay, so you want me to, I can't leave St. Louis, I can't even get on my plane unless I will be blocked at the door.
We've called the gate.
Unless I address Jeff Bezos in the Post. Sure, okay, so, well, since I have to get home, I will answer that question. So, look, I've been very public with my concern, disappointment, dismay even, with what has happened starting 11 days before the election of last year. I don't participate in much in social media, as you might have detected. I kind of detest social media, but I did tweet out that it was a demonstration of cowardice on the part of someone who owned a newspaper that was known for courage, and that it was merely an invitation for further bullying by Trump against the Washington Post and against other media outlets. And I think that's exactly how Trump interpreted the decision by Jeff Bezos not to run an editorial endorsement during the presidential campaign. Had he made that decision 6 months earlier, had he made it a year earlier, 3 years earlier at best, I would have said, fine, that's entirely a reasonable decision. Anybody can decide they don't want to make presidential endorsements. But it was clear to me then, and it's clearer to me today, that that was a decision that was made for fear that Trump would return to office, that he was on the cusp of returning to office, and that he would do what he promised to do, which was to seek vengeance on his perceived political enemies. And Jeff Bezos had been perceived as a political enemy for one reason, and for one reason only, and that was the Washington Post, which he owned. And Trump hated the Washington Post. He criticized Bezos throughout, starting in his campaign, by the way, and he barred the Washington Post for a period of time, as well as some other media outlets, from being in the press pool along with him, which is fine. We just covered him in other ways. But and then he interfered, and he tried to raise the postal rates. He talked about, because that would affect the Amazon business. And he threatened, he said they should be twice as high, then he said 3 times as high, then he said no, it should really be 4 times as high. You kind of got the sense he was making it up, I don't know, but maybe it was the result of deliberate study. And then he interfered in a huge $10 billion Defense Department contract for cloud computing services to ensure that it did not go to Amazon. And on the first round, it did not go to Amazon. And so I think that Bezos was understandably concerned that Trump would try to disrupt the business of Amazon and its private space company. Amazon's big area of growth is cloud computing. It does a lot of that for the federal government. That's an area of growth. It does a lot of that for intelligence agencies, the Defense Department, places like that. And Trump could just say, we're not going to give any contracts to Amazon. And you may recall that when he had his little breakup with Elon Musk, one of the first things he said is, well, maybe one of the quickest way we can save money is not give any contracts to Elon Musk's companies. That's the first reaction he had. So, and the same is true of Blue Origin, Bezos' space company. That would be wholly dependent on government contracts. And look, I mean, what he's done since, Amazon agreed to buy the so-called documentary from Melania, and about Melania, that she's the executive producer of. I'm sure it'll be a very independent documentary, worth every penny of the $40 million that Amazon's paying for it, which was a little more, just about 3 times the price that was offered from the next highest bidder. And then subsequent to that, Amazon has bought the rights to the Apprentice television series. And we don't know what they're paying, but suddenly they were interested in the Apprentice series. Trump he stopped participating in that program when he ran for office in 2015. There was no bidding for that from Amazon in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 1, 2, 3. Suddenly, in 2025, I forgot 2024, and 2025, all of a sudden, they're interested in buying this incredibly important asset, the Apprentice TV series, which I'm sure there's a huge audience of people who would like to watch him say, "You're fired again." But we get to see that every day. In any event, so that I'm concerned about all of that. That said, and I'm concerned about what he's done with the opinion pages of the Post, where they've essentially purged all columnists who are left of center. I find that to be undemocratic for a newspaper that says democracy dies in darkness. They should have a wide range of opinion. They should have conservative opinions. They did have conservative opinions. If they wanted to add more, that's fine. And the editorials themselves, to me, have just gone completely off the rails. But the newsroom, I should make clear, the newsroom continues to do extraordinarily good work. I'm really impressed with what they're doing. They are holding this government to account. There's a revelatory story day after day. And they've lost a lot of talent, but they have a deep reservoir of talent, and they're showing how talented they are every day. And I support them, I subscribe, and I admire what they're doing, and I want them to keep doing it.
Thank you for your remarks. When you consider local news outlets, how do you see the American press being able to continue its important work while attempting to weather economic headwinds that outlets like the Washington Post may not necessarily face?
I'm sorry, you want me to address the issue of the challenges facing local
Economic
challenges facing local.
How do you see local press continue to do its work when you're seeing readerships decline, but you may not have the same economic pressures in the same way, at a national outlet like the Post?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the greatest crisis in American journalism is at the local level. We see so many local news organizations going out of business, so many so-called news deserts, or even things that are close to a news desert where there's half a reporter covering a community, basically that, if that. So I think it's a huge challenge. On the other hand, I see other places where, they seem to be doing well, whether they're commercial enterprises or nonprofit. They're holding their own. I live in Western Massachusetts. The Berkshire Eagle was thankfully bought by local owners. They've done a great job of managing it. They do a nice job of covering the community, and so that's great to see. I see, like further in New England, VT Digger is a nonprofit that has had considerable success on state level. Cal Matters in California has done well. I think the San Francisco Chronicle is doing pretty well. I think there are any number of examples out there of news organizations that are doing reasonably well. And I'm not being Pollyannish about it, but I think that the ones that do the best are doing what I think they ought to be doing, is every day they ought to be asking themselves, what is the value that we have? At every morning meeting, they ought to be saying, what is the best thing of value that we have provided our readers today? Tangible value, actual tangible value, something, and psychic value, those two areas. So how do they see us as the tangible value is something that's a practical use to them in their daily lives that says, I need to have this in order to live my life better in this community. And ask themselves, what did we do today? What did we miss? And how do we recover from that? And what are we doing tomorrow? And those questions should be asked every single day at every morning meeting, in my view. And then they ought to ask about psychic value. How do people see us as a representative of them in terms of holding to account institutions and things of that sort? How do they see us as sort of being their proxy, because they can't do it themselves as citizens? So, you know, when Bezos, when we came up with the motto, democracy dies in darkness, he said it's not a motto, it's a mission statement. And he said, I don't want us to be seen as a, when we were trying to come up with the idea, which was an excruciating 2-year miserable process of coming up with that phrase, he said, I don't want it to be a product that we want people to buy. I want it to be an idea that people want to belong to. And how do news organizations represent something that people say, I want to be part of that. I want to be part of that. They represent me. And so, because it's not a purchase and selling relationship. It's just it's almost a personal relationship. It's a relationship. And we need to think about it as a relationship, and what do we need to do to strengthen those bonds between the news organization and its community. It's not an easy answer. I don't mean to be facile or anything like that. I know how difficult it is, but that is the way that I would approach it.
Thank you so much, Marty.
Thank you.